And I was hired by Jan Opprins for Opprins plant in Rijkevorsel to develop a system for bamboo propagation, fast propagation. You have to imagine that if you try to split a plant, a big clump or small clumps, and you can divide it in one or two, and then you have to plant it. It takes several years to get a stock. Now with tissue culture, at one point, one of the earliest successes was with Fargesia rufa, a garden bamboo. And from the mother plant until more than 10,000 or maybe 50,000 plant, that took us, less than a year to get there. So then we have small plants, and then you transplant them in the greenhouse in pots, and then outside, and then you have saleable plants of a certain size, a certain pot size. So that was what I had to develop. So, but that was not an easy task. So at that time in the late 80s and the early 90s, there were hundreds of labs, literally hundreds of labs in Western Europe, the US, and especially in Asia, and also in South America, that were trying to develop protocols for fast propagation of bamboo in tissue culture. So. And actually, it took me 10 years to break the code. But the rewarding thing was if things get very hard, that's what I like most, when things get very hard. So the situation was like that. I broke the code, maybe in early 90s, and then it started to work out. Now, I think since 1995. I think there must have been something like 30 million plants that have been produced via tissue culture in our labs, both for temperate and tropical bamboos. So that's not negligible. So for tropical bamboos, it's mostly for plantations, and for temperate bamboos, it's mostly for gardens. So I left the company Opprins around 2012, I think. But last year I was involved also in so it's the whole thing was split in two. So the temperate bamboos are still in Belgium for production. It's now called Plant Select. And then the tropical bamboos are produced in Indonesia, in Yogyakarta, in Bambu Nusa Verde. And so as I said, a lot of bamboos can be produced, and at a certain quality can be produced year-round at lower prices than before. So when I started, a bamboo would typically be very expensive and very rare if you want to buy it in the 80s. But by optimizing these methods, we could make bamboo available for just a few euros or dollars for anyone to buy for a garden. So that typically helped spreading bamboos both in tropical and temperate production, so to speak. So that's why how I came into bamboo. So, and still now, let's say, almost more than almost 30 years after I found the key to that. So I think the lab in Rijkevorsel, Belgium, and the lab in Indonesia are still the only labs in the world that can do many bamboos via this method and propagate proper, let's say small plantlets that can be shipped to Africa and so on and so forth. So that's basically my background: horticulture and plant production. But along the way, I was very interested in all kinds of things, because I've looked, I've looked at bamboo from the perspective of DNA. We studied the DNA and the genes and stuff, and we also looked very closely to what happens inside the bamboo. One of the big problems with bamboo tissue culture was that, yes, you can do it, but if you try to root it and get it outside, then maybe only 70% of the plants survive. Now, if you want to produce 1 million plants, that's a loss of 300,000. So you cannot afford that in a commercial production system. And that's why we went really deep into the metabolism of bamboo tissue culture to try to figure out what went wrong and how we could solve it. And then later, around 2005 or so, we got to almost 100% rooting in the greenhouse year round. So that's the background, the technical background, how I came into bamboo. So my journey has taken many turns in these things. Not only was I very much interested in science, because if you want to develop a technology, you can do trial and error, but doesn't help unless you understand the problems properly. And that's what we did with our team. I did not do that alone, of course. I had a small team of a researcher. We worked together with universities. Various universities, and we had a fantastic team in the tissue culture lab. So, but why it was also proven to be very difficult, because if you want to, let's say, repeat this process into other labs, that turned out to be very difficult. We tried in the south, in Georgia. We tried with a lab, Briggs Nurseries in Washington State. We tried with North American Plants, a lab in Oregon. So I've been very often to these areas. But that was not very successful. And that's so if you so my kind of legacy in this case was a very efficient production system, which has produced now up till at least 30 million plants that are growing in gardens in Western Europe, but even also growing in plantations in Africa and Indonesia. So for various, that's the background, and that's the technical work that I did. So I had, in your opinion, where tissue culture is at. I know this is deviating a little bit, but the tissue cultures are a viable way to produce plants for plantations. Like, they've proven themselves, because you've been in this longer than anybody. Yeah. So just to give you an example, there was in the 90s, there was a big program in India to produce 100 or 500 million plants. But you have to produce them first. Huh? So where do you get them? That's not. You can name numbers in policies, but to get them, that's very different. And various labs in India, 50 labs in India, have been working on this problem as well. For me, it's a kind of chain. You let's say the production of small plants is a kind of let's say plants to be planted in plantations or in gardens. That's just part of a process. Huh? So you start from materials from which you can take cuttings, or you can take, depending on the species, you can take cuttings, or you make divisions, or you can make rhizome cuttings or whatever. But in this case, by miniaturizing the plants, you could go much faster. And even if you produce 20,000 plants for a plantation, then in Africa, for example, people can raise them in a greenhouse and still divide them afterwards, because they are very juvenile and very strong growers. So then they can divide them in 4, 5, or even 10 pieces, and then they have a multiple of this. So the tissue culture is a means to get to a solution. It's not the solution. It's part of a solution of getting bamboos produced and planted. So that's how I always looked at it. So
how does it work with the flowering? Because I get different answers from people. I've had people tell me that they turned off the flowering and that the bamboos
tissue culture. What you mean tissue culture? Yeah, there's no unique answer to that. So and there's no unique answer to the how flowering occurs. Some flowers are known. Some bamboos are known to flower gregariously and then die. But even many tempered bamboos, they flower and then they continue to grow. For example, in the late 80s, 87, around 87, Pseudosazea japonica, and I knew various stands all over the Netherlands and Belgium. I observed at least 30 stands of Pseudosazea japonica, which had been growing there for maybe 50 years or so. They grew, they flowered, they died, and they regrew from their rhizomes. So, but a big problem in temperate bamboos and ornamental plants was that the genetical basis of Fargesias was very narrow. So you had Fargesia muriele, which was only one species, and the Fargesia nitida was the other group, and that grew out of a provenance of certain seeds from the early 20th century. So you had a few varieties of nitida, but muriele was distributed all over Europe and large parts of the US, and it came from one plant which was introduced. So that's a big liability, a big risk. And it started flowering gregariously in the 90s. That was a big problem. And there were two solutions to the problem. One was to collect other Fargesias, Fargesia robusta, Fargesias cabridas, Fargesia angustissima, Jusaigu, and so on, that were collected by several people from China. And there was also a big rise in taxonomy in Fargesia. It turned out to be a very, very large group. And the second solution was so first introduce new clones, which we also immediately tried to introduce into tissue culture. And one of these clones, Fargesia rufa, then turned out to be a winner. Let's say we produced millions of these plants, and as I said, within 1 year we had over 50,000 plants just from one mother plant. As far as the let's say why it flowers, we have no clue, and nobody has any clue whatever they tell you. It's a kind of internal clock, could be an internal clock, but then again, Muriele was just one plant. And also in the 80s, a lot of flowering occurred in Fargesia in China, in the panda region, Sichuan and so on and so forth. And they left, pandas like to eat bamboos, and flowering was not the best. And for example, some theories were put forward. Julian Campbell, who was working at that time in China, saw some relations to earthquakes, for example. So, but you can never prove this. And but what I did, and that was very interesting, was actually when Fargesia muriele started to flower. That's a stress condition. So I was working at that time for Operins Plant, but I was working at the university. So I used part of the greenhouse, and I put flowering Fargesias that we got in the greenhouse. We had tens of thousands of Fargesia muriele, which all started to flower, which was a disaster. And I put them in various compartments of the greenhouse, warm and light, warm and less light, and cold and less light, and cold and lots of light, and so on. And it turned out to be when we had a warm condition with low light, then the plants regrew. That was fantastic because all the other plants died. We also studied stress enzymes inside of the plant, and we saw that the stress enzymes went really up, but in the plants that recovered, and there were only a few plants, but in science it's very important to get a grip on things, and by treating it in warmer conditions, humid conditions, and with less light, the plants recovered. That was fantastic because nobody thought it would be possible. But then again, so the phenomenon can be very disastrous. Also in tropical parts, but in many cases that has to do with a narrow genetic basis. If you try to, from one plant, you try to have millions of hectares and it all flowers, then you run into problem. But if you have if you have many genotypes in your plantation, starting not from only one plant, but from various seedlings, let's say for Dendrocalamus types or Bambusa bambos, then yeah, you spread the risk and you have not such a narrow basis, and then you for gardens, flowering is not such a problem unless you're a grower. For people living off bamboo in tropics, it can be a disaster unless you are able to control it. On the other hand, there's these flowering plants, many of them, they produce tons of seed, tons of seeds, and that provides another opportunity to get new generations of plants. So, but there's no unique answer to what causes flowering. There's only bits and pieces. So, and related to tissue culture, there was a report in the late 80s by an Indian lady, and she could induce flowering in tissue culture. By giving too much hormones or cytokinins, they could induce flowering. It was even published in the very prestigious journal Nature. So what we wanted to do in tissue culture is to avoid giving too many hormones and then to induce flowering. So what we did was take a minimum minimorum, the least possible or least needed cytokinins or hormones, and then we did not have flowering. I think I remember only a few rare cases of flowering when plants were transplanted later, so maybe 5 cases or so.
I had read an article that was out of India just recently, actually in the spring, where they had convinced the farmers to buy Bambusa valgoa. It was produced by tissue culture, and then it all went into
the famous Bima Bamboo, you mean? Huh?
So I was told that, I mean, Bima Bamboo told me that they had turned off the flowering element or what in the DNA.
No.
And I said, how do you know?
They have no idea. So in Bima Bamboo, when they started, they claimed that bamboo would produce 100 tons per hectare per year. Things like that. It's unbelievable what they told people, and so anyway. So we know. So as another part of my research. First, I have to say that I'm both a scientist and engineer. As an engineer, I want to optimize things, and as a scientist, I want to understand things. And my mentor on the scientific side was Professor Liese. He was now he's 94 or so, but he was really the big man in the big name in bamboo anatomy and bamboo uses and bamboo preservation and all these things. And he's one of my close friends now, but he was really my mentor because, as you know, people get idealistic in bamboo and things can solve problems, many problems. But I was really confronted very often by Liese, stick to the facts. Huh? So there's no interpretation of facts if you don't have facts, or you can look at it from a positive side, but you have to prove things, and that's and for example, he was also involved. We had a Bamboo for Europe project, and a Bamboo for Europe project was an idea: can we grow bamboo in Europe for the industries, for the wood industries, for the energy industries, for biomass in various ways, pyrolysis or just compressed bamboo for heating and so on. And that turned us a lot, and we tried to not adapt Europe to bamboo, but we tried to adapt bamboo to Europe. So where does it fit into the chain? And that's an interesting story, because it reverses the kind of idea that many people have, that bamboo is the solution. But bamboo can always be part of the solution. So that's why I wanted in this program to adapt bamboo to Europe. So we tested several genotypes growing in Portugal, Germany, Spain and Belgium. So we had small plots of 1 hectare and so on, different genotypes to see how well they grew. And then we had to chip them, we had to store them, we had to do all kinds of researches. Then we went to industry in medium density fiber boards or hard boards. In the board industry, we took them for pyrolysis and all kinds of gasification or energy uses and so on. So in itself, it was quite a successful project in the sense that all things were good. So we could take away all the bottlenecks. The only bottleneck we could not take away, the crucial ones, is to convince farmers to plant bamboo, because they need to be sure they have some end user. So as long as you don't have this chain, and bamboo, Europe was not ready. Now there are 20 years later, there are various things in Europe going on. So planting in Portugal and Spain, in the hope that they can provide raw material to industries. There's also some in Tuscany, for example. There's bamboo fibers and bamboo silk being used in fabrics for let's say the Italian fashion industry. And you can do fantastic things with it, but you need an end user. What we tried to do with the whole consortium was to map out where the difficulties are. First, you have to provide enough plants at a reasonable price. Then you have to grow them in the field, and then you have to harvest them. And then how do you harvest them? And these things were all solved, but unless you have the whole chain in Europe or other places, you don't. And I also saw that in the US, many people planting bamboos before they had end users. So there's always the chicken and egg problem. But I learned a lot there from, let's say, expectations and managing risks. So. But again, the idea was there some very interesting things came out of there. For example, we could harvest it with corn harvesters. That was easy to do because once you harvest corn in autumn, then in winter you could harvest the bamboo, because you could. The interesting thing was that you could harvest bamboo and chip it and keep it for, let's say, you could provide raw materials to the industry for about 7 or 8 months in the year, and you could use machines from agriculture or forestry during the calm seasons.
You're clear cutting.
Yeah, and one.
You're talking about clear cutting?
No. So if you have Philostachys, you have a very dense rhizome net. So you cut every year. You cut about 1/3. So okay. And this idea came out of. I had learned that idea from Georgia, from the University of Georgia, who did in the 1960s a lot of research on bamboo and bamboo harvesting and the great amounts that you can do. And all in all, listen, we haven't published much on this, but actually one of the most important things that we came out of this was the following. So now we're looking at water being a scarce resource for the future. We found with German partners, the German partners in the group found, we didn't find, they did a lot of experiments, how much water does bamboo absorb to grow 1 kilogram of raw material. It was under very controlled conditions. And actually the water use efficiency, as we called it, of bamboo was much, much greater than of almost any other crop except for corn, which is a special plant. But most of the other crops needed much more water to build, to grow and to produce fruits or seeds than bamboo. So bamboo is a very efficient water user. So we see that in the crop. All of them. We tested Philostachys, we tested bambusas, we tested Fargesia, and they all use water very efficiently. And I would like to, in the next 10 years or so, I would like to deepen that facet or that aspect of bamboo with others as well. So
there was a conversation. There was a conversation I had with Arif Rabiq, and he talks a lot about So he deals with, asper,
Yes.
dendrocalamuses, big bamboos and stuff, right? And he talks a lot about bamboos holding water. And then when the drier seasons come and even droughts come, that the bamboos by default have to give the water back because water equalizes.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. See, I have not studied it, so I will about something scientific or some bamboo, let's say metabolism, which I have not studied or have not read. I cannot comment really. But actually, if you have a bamboo forest or anything bamboo, they shed a lot of in spring. They shed, or for temperate bamboos, they shed a lot of leaves. So there's always a mulching layer, and that's really very efficient in holding water in the soil. That in itself. And we have also seen in very dry summers, they keep their leaves very long. For example, in South Africa, bamboo balcoa, which was introduced in the early 20th century, they still grow when eucalyptus sheds all its leaves in South Africa. So for some reason, and that's what we tried to find out, and the result was that what we called water use efficiency was very high. So let's say that I think it was, I can look it up, but it was like 300 liters of rain. Some of it goes into the soil, but was used for 1 kilogram for biomass, dry biomass, and not wet biomass. But for other beets and other crops in agriculture and horticulture, that was double almost. So they could, bamboo grows in various ways very efficiently. So that was one of the beautiful outcomes.
What about intercropping? Like
Yeah, that was also one of the things. So, yeah, in the 80s and the 90s, there was a lot of research going on in India and China, for example. I was also involved in a number of European projects, Bamboo for Europe, but also with Asian partners. And with a Philippine colleague of mine, we compiled a compendium of bamboo research, and I can send you the link. And we compiled from various websites. Now we have Google and all that, but then you had to go to databases. We looked up for various research from the most obscure journals and so on. We tried to compile it because we wanted the world to learn what is already there.
Oh, I would love to get
in
a
this
copy
case,
of that. Is that
sorry?
still available? Is it still available?
Yes, I have it. I have it on the internet, so it's available as a PDF. So I can share
I'm
it with you.
ordering that today. I would
But
like
but
to.
but you see in the, for example, in the 1940s and 50s, in Congo, for example, which was then colonized by the Belgians, they did a lot of research on bamboo for producing, but they even did trials with dynamite to blow up bamboos, to divide them and so on. So there was a lot of crazy stuff out there, and not so crazy. And when we also saw in India, for example, that they tried with densities of 10,000 plants per hectare, or intercropping. So intercropping, there was a lot of research done in India, and intercropping certainly is one of the best things, because if you plant your rows of bamboo at 7 meters or 10 meters, they provide a lot of shade. The mulch is there. So intercropping works. You have only to take into account the seasons. You could grow various even flowers or vegetables there, which could feed on a plantation. You could feed a whole village with intercropping. So how to make best use of what is there. It's not only, that's why it's good that you bring up this question, because bamboo is not the solution; it's part of a solution. And so that's always been it's always been, in the beginning I was also very enthusiastic, and bamboo is a solution, but then Professor Lise dragged me with my feet to the ground, and since then I've learned a lot. And to my good. So you cannot live on hopes and dreams. You have to prove things. You have to work out solutions, and if it doesn't fit, you have to make sure that you can convince people how it can fit and so on. but it's not always a solution. For example, in the board industry, medium fiber boards, so the raw material, it's in Belgium, and raw material had to be imported from the south of France, which is almost 1,000 kilometers. But let's say if we could only not make bamboo boards, but have only 5 or 10% of the raw material, that would already have an impact on the whole stream throughout the year for biomass. And eventually it also turned out that mixing bamboo fibers into the medium density fiber boards, we got a better quality of boards, stronger, more resistant and so on.
Mixing with what?
So mixing, normally it was with pine wood or waste wood and so on. And if you
eucalyptus.
Sorry?
Eucalyptus.
Yeah, eucalyptus is they planted a lot of so if you think about single solutions, in Portugal they planted
together.
Yeah, no, but okay, but in Portugal, in single solutions, they had hardly any forest left. All were cut, and in the 60s and 70s they planted a lot of eucalyptus, only eucalyptus. Now they have monocultures of eucalyptus, a lot of fires in summer and so on. So never do that. So find solutions where it's part of a solution. Talk to other people. Huh? Talk to so.
No, I was just wondering if bamboo and eucalyptus had been used together, like in fiber.
I don't know. They might have been used in Portugal now, but really, eucalypts in Portugal, they suck the whole thing dry. Huh? So they suck all the let's say any water that falls is sucked out into the eucalypts. So and they thrive, but nothing else thrives there. So and that you don't have with bamboo. So I have not been in the business of plantations and intercropping for the past 10 years or so. So I cannot say much on what is happening now. But it's just the central thing is bamboo can be a part of a solution. But don't expect it to be the solution. Don't plant monocultures everywhere. Use the experience of local people. Use their knowledge on how to do things. So, and that's a very different process than thinking here's a solution. So,
yes.
Anyway,
agreed. So, where do you see bamboos going? Does it depend on? Because Europe is different than the U.S. is different, than Asia is different than Africa. You've worked in all of them. They must all have nuances of.
They all have nuances, but there was in the 90s a big, it's absolutely necessary. Bamboo is a really big part of the solution in, for example, India, Indonesia, and perhaps also Africa. I think so, but in many cases, in Ethiopia, you have millions of hectares of bamboo. You have in Congo, in the jungle, and so on. But in many other parts of the Africa, it's not native. So, for example, in South Africa, there was a number imported. In Tanzania, there was a number imported, and people started using it for fencing, for catching water, and have water transport, and so on and so forth. So it can be a big part of a solution for deforestation. So, for example, in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, they cut a lot of plants and they burn it to make charcoal to live and to make food and so on and so forth. So bamboo could be a solution. But a friend of mine has, in Benin, for example, he has a plantation of bamboo. But people go into the woods and cut whatever they can to sustain their life. So in order to think of bamboo as a solution, it's always very important to train people and to work with local people and so on and so forth, with local farmers, so they know best how to utilize it. So with our Western way of thinking, hey, here's the solution, that's never works, or leads to mostly disasters. So that's what, or loss of money and loss of effort, and I've seen that happen in many cases. So let's try to avoid. Let's try to learn from the mistakes we made. So let's try to learn and do it better next time. But as far as I can see, when we were working in the 90s, there was a lot of interest in a lot of work in India, traditionally, because they have been using bamboo for ages. And also in China, it's big. So there was a lot of bamboo flooring for containers and trucks coming out of China in the 80s. They had lots of machines and so on to process bamboo. But in Europe, there was nothing. In the United States, there was hardly anything. So in the early 90s, you had to start from new. And in Africa, there was almost nothing as well. So that's I see a big potential there. But we have to remain a bit realistic. So even if you grow bamboo as a farmer, you have to compete with other crops. So if you deliver biomass and you expect to get more than that from waste wood, that's not going to happen, because the factories and the industry will pay for the cheapest material that does the job. So, and in this sense, it's always good to look higher into the value chain. So, for example, burning bamboo is the worst thing you can do, because that's a waste of energy and a waste of things. But in the top of the pyramid would be, for example, do certain bamboos contain something that could be working against cancer or working against. So you have, as the top of the pyramid, you would be needing much less bamboos, but the added value is much higher. And in between, there's a lot of materials that you can use. Reinforced paper is one, for example. So when I was young, we made coffee with paper things, and they always tore up. So, and by putting bamboo inside that paper, it became much stronger. So it's being used in many ways. And I see a lot of things happening in newspapers about bamboo, and so it's growing. Awareness is growing, but still need to see the big volumes and the big uses. So, and I think the best thing is not to wait for the big uses to happen, but locally many things could be done. So.
Yeah.
I don't know the situation in the US now, but for example, I was in '93, I think, in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State, at a workshop organized by ABS on uses of bamboo. It could be, there was an interesting paper, for example, for fodder for cattle and fodder for horses and so on. There was a small problem. There was too much silicon in there, so you could not give only bamboo to bamboo leaves, because then the teeth of the cattle would not benefit from that. And things like this, you have to learn. So I was in 2000 for a conference of ABS in Atlanta, and they have pandas there, and people went out to harvest bamboo all over Georgia. Then came back, and it might, in many cases, it happened that the panda just said, "No, I don't like this." So he didn't touch the bamboo. So in some cases it worked. So you learn by experience which type of bamboos you have to harvest, how you have to store them, under which conditions, so that the panda would eat it. So there's a lot to be learned about bamboo. And I'm very glad to see many people working. I really like that. When I started, for example, INBAR was just starting, and all these organizations were just starting. There were World Bamboo Congresses, but only initially really by the ABS, by the American Bamboo Society, was a big motor for that. And only gradually in the 90s, we saw a lot of things coming together. So organizations that worked, World Bamboo Congresses, international communication. The internet has changed all of this. And also technologies for example, in biotechnology. Now there's a lot of papers coming out from China about genetic sequences, things that may have to do with growth, with flowering, and so on and so forth. So So we learn a lot. So for me, I come from a horticulture or agriculture background, and for me bamboo was one of the most difficult plants that you can imagine. You have no background of crossing. You have no idea what you're working with. Most tropical bamboos are hexaploid, meaning they have 6 sets of chromosomes, of each chromosome, which means that you have no idea where the genes work and how they are located and so on and so forth. So it is one of the difficult plants. And again, in the 80s, there were quite a number of there was one Chinese lady trying to cross bamboo and get new hybrids out of them. But then I found a paper that already in the 1930s there was a hybrid of bamboo and rice, and that was interesting. It was I don't know if it still exists, but people already in the 1930s experimented with hybrids between bamboo and rice. And I was telling this to Chris Stapleton, a famous British bamboo taxonomist, and he suggested, well, let's call it Rambo then. So you see, so even taxonomists can be funny sometimes.
Did you get a big plant with lots of rice on it?
Yeah, so I don't know. But solutions do not always have to be found in biotechnology. So, for example, I asked my students when I was teaching at the university about biotechnology. I asked them, so you have rice. Say you have rice, and you want to double the yield of rice. How do you do that? And if you do that via breeding, you can think, yeah, maybe 1 or 2% better. But the question was, how can you double it? So, and then people are flabbergasted because you can try something. What do you try? And I wanted to think them out of the box, but this already existed, this solution. So in Madagascar, there was a Jesuit father, head of a school, and at that time the International Rice Research Institute always recommended all over the world that you have to seed rice seeds. Then after 7 days you have to transplant them. And so on. There was a whole protocol that people had to follow to be successful. But the pupils in Madagascar made a mistake. They waited 3 days too long to transplant it. And instead of throwing it away, the father said, well, let's look at it. And they doubled the yield in rice. And now this method is being used all over the world for doubling rice, doubling wheat, doubling sorghum things, just by allowing plants to develop a more healthy root system, which benefits everything, because the soil is an overlooked thing in plants, but that's so crucial. So you can get, and maybe it's only 50% more, but it's even better than you can have by typical breeding. And again, this shows to me that so scientists can only play a role, but sometimes things happen in a very different way. So in this case, it was a mistake made by the students or small children in the rice, in the agriculture school, and that led to a worldwide increase in farming yields. And that's the things we have to look for. So not unique solutions. Look outside, look across the walls, and look to what others are doing, and learn from that as well. As a scientist, science can only be a part of the solution. It's never the solution. So anyway, so that's a bit about.
That was a long answer to the journey of how you got to. So talk a little bit about what you're doing now, what your most recent.
Yeah, so I did a lot of research in different parts, and one of the things I always ask myself, what makes bamboo so special? So you can have, it grows 30 meters tall, and it is connected to the rest of the plant by a column neck. The tropical bamboos of only a few centimeters or inches. And it has a root system which is very shallow, and still it bends and it doesn't break. In some cases it breaks, but in most cases it doesn't, and it just recovers. What makes it so special? And it is hollow. It is a light material. It is a composite material, because if you look at the anatomy, you see that the fibers run from the internode to the other internode, and all the fibers is just one big piping system, and it's interspersed with parenchyma. So it's a kind of natural composite system, and that's very efficient. And it's hollow, and it has internode diaphragms and so on. So I was very interested in how can we understand this from an engineering and mathematical way of thinking about it. So I looked at various mathematical methods. But then at a certain evening, I was reading a book from the library, and I have a few copies of here, and it was by Martin Gardner, the famous writer on mathematics, who wrote in Scientific American, who wrote many books to interest recreational mathematics and so on. And there was an article about Piet Hein, and Piet Hein was a Danish mathematician, an inventor, a crazy guy. I love mavericks like him. And there were people in Stockholm trying to design a spherical stork, and they had to have a mole in the center, underground, and then also traffic had to go as smoothly as possible. And the architects made lines and circles and so on to get something like that. And then Piet Hein said, well, actually, do you know there's one curve to do that, one equation to do that? And actually, if you look here, just I drew it on the blackboard. So, for example, this is a circle, this one. And this is a super ellipse, a super circle, circumscribing the circle. And this is called then a subcircle. And the interesting thing is that it differs from the circle only in one number. So I'm not going to tell about the equations that do that, but just imagine one number difference between the circle and the square, or between an ellipse and a rectangle. That means we have always been taught that a circle and a square are very different. Male, female, whatever things they invent about this. But they're one big family. So you can smoothly transform one into the other. And that I found very interesting, because the shape you see here, this one, is actually, because I had a broad interest and a broad knowledge of bamboo, this is Bambusa quadrangularis, the square bamboo. And if you kind of look at it, of the cross section, it is not circular, it's not square, it's something in between. And I have made a print to get some idea of how this looks like. For example, if you look at the cross section, it's really something like this, right? And if then I learned later that this is the equation, but it was just one of the circles, and we could model actually the square bamboo, the shape of the square bamboo, very efficiently in just a few numbers. And actually, later I learned that Gabriel Amé, a French mathematician from the early 1800s, was really already had written about this. He wanted to model crystals, but I found how I could also work with square bamboos. And then we started to think about how can we. What Bambusa is very interesting, because it's Himono means winter. So most of the temperate bamboos in China grow from April to June, say, new shoots. And then they have a whole season to lignify and get strong wood. Now, Bambusa shoots only shoot in late August, September, October. And then by October, November, they have to withstand, let's say, snowfalls and rains and winds and so on. And the interesting thing is that if you make, instead of a round shape, if you take a shape like this, you have much more defense against bending and against torsion. Yeah? So these were the kind of things we started to study first. So nature does nothing in vain. And there's some Bima Bamboo is a genus, and there are some 20 or 20 plus species so Quadrangularis. Actually, it was not known to Western science until the 1890s, but in China it has been used and known for a long time. So that was the start of my investigations, and we started to look at. You find a lot of square stems in plants. All the Lamiaceae, they have square, like sage and so on. They all have square stems in some way. And you also have plants like raspberry, for example. If you look at it, they have pentagonal stems. If you look at cacti, they have pentagonal or whatever stems, or heptagonal, and so on. So you have a lot of these different symmetries in nature. And so the problem was that with this equation of Gabriel Amé and P10, the super circles back there, we could not describe starfish. We could not describe triangles. For example, I have drawn, for example, a starfish there and a triangle, a diatom there. But with this equation, we could not do that. So in 1997, I generalized this equation, and all of a sudden I could do all that. For example, if you look at shapes like this, you could morph a circle into a triangle or a heptagon or a starfish or flowers and so on. You could all do that just by adding one or two numbers. So, and the interesting thing is that a circle and a square and a starfish and so on were no longer different. You could morph them one into the other just by having a few sliders. That's all, and that changed the whole of the idea of differences. So you have a unifying principle, and actually, this I published this in the American Journal of Botany in 2003. And then it became, say, a kind of overnight wildfire, because all over the world it was on websites. And since then, now 20 or so years later, after the American Journal of Botany journal, it's being used all over the world. My work is being used in things you wouldn't expect. For example, psychology. So people used to be able, so here you have a circle, here you have the square, what do you like most? But now this is another ball game, because you have all kinds of intermediate shapes, and what do you like most is not a black and white thing. There's a lot of shapes intermediate. But back in 2003 I wrote a book, so it's called The Invention of the Circle. And I just show it because on the cover you see a lot of shapes that relate to shapes in nature, and that was so. For example, in that only goes shapes, and you look differently at shapes. For example, most of the things you see in shells are like this, and then you think of spirals. But actually, if you study shapes, mollusks, most of them are like this. They have a kind of discontinuous growth. Has to do with the moon, has to do with tides and all that. So, but now we have for the first time a continuous transformation that allows to model all these things. One interesting thing was that we, since 2000, that was an interesting one, a bit of a journey. So in 2012, we organized in Belgium the World Bamboo Congress. And we had 38 different nationalities, and we had over 300 people. It was very interesting. But Professor Lise was also there, my mentor. And he had a student from China. He did his PhD in Hamburg with Walter Lise in the late 80s. And Yulong Ding, his name was. And Yulong Ding and Professor Liesen and I got together, and he said to Yulong Ding, "So when are you going to do something with Johan's formula?" And that was very interesting, because after that, Yulong Ding became dean of the forestry department in Nanjing University, and he hired Pei Jianxi. He was just a doctoral student, and he just got his PhD on entomology, insects. And he started working on bamboo. And since then, we have tested more than 40,000 specimens, biological specimens, bamboo leaves. We have tested bamboo seeds. We have tested ginkgo seeds. We have tested starfish. We have tested diatoms and so on. 40,000 avian eggs. All avian eggs could be modeled with my formula. And only with 2 or 3 numbers are sufficient to discriminate any bamboo species around the world. Just by, maybe I can show an image later. I can show that's that's really, for example, maybe I can show. This is an image from a book of mine. So the red curve and the black curve are just overlaid. So with just 2 numbers, we can discriminate between any species of Philostachys or any shape around the world. So we still have to, if we want to use that for taxonomists and so, we still have to do a lot of work. But whether you talk about avian eggs, or you talk about starfish, or you talk about diatoms, or you talk about flowers, or you talk about waves and sounds, it's all one uniform description. So, and now it's being used in over 200 applications around the world, from lasers to the modeling of the heart, to psychology, uses in biology, physics. In 2013, I started with a friend of mine, an antenna engineer. We started an antenna company, and we produce now, I think we sold 10 million antennas to Cisco and so on for their Wi-Fi routers. And all the optimization and all the computation is also based on the same equation. And again, the equation is not much more difficult than the equation of a circle. It's just a kind of flexible. It's a flexible circle. So, and that my life has been evolving around this one for the past 10 years. Apart from focusing on bamboo leaves and bamboo culms on a scientific way, testing more than, I think we tested like 5,000 bamboo leaves and 2,000 culms of bamboo and so on, and all could be done with this one formula. So originally, as I said, the shapes are called super circles because they're circumscribing the circles. So initially I called this general version super formula. But mathematicians did not like that, and then now they called it Gielis transformation. So I have in mathematics and in sciences, I've my name attached to what they call a major development in science. So that's not too bad, huh? So
That's
so,
amazing.
so that's why I learned a lot from bamboo, and so I think I told you yesterday a bit. For me, bamboo was also about the growth habit. So people in philosophy and science and psychology tend to think of a tree image. So branching out, branching networks, branching out, rooting, branching out. But bamboo is different because it grows via rhizomes, underground, which are basically horizontally growing stems with roots on the nodes. So bamboo can grow underground and can pop up, shoots can pop up on unexpected places. And so for me, bamboo became a model not only for resilience and one of the four sacred plants in China, but it became a multi-purpose thing. It became a symbol of resilience for me. So standing up straight when you fall, never back down. But also it came a kind of new way of thinking about things. So and actually it's also a model for the internet. So things move in unexpected ways, and sometimes you have these coincidental, fantastic people that you meet all over the world. So that's if we think more in society more about a bamboo model, then we look at things differently than just branching and just one becomes two and so on, which is predominant. So if you look at science and technology and the way we think, there are, in Western science at least, you have the circle, which is the predominant shape that is used everywhere in science. The language of science is basically using a straight line and a circle to dig, and all the rest is technicalities. And on the other hand, we use the tree image for evolution and so on. But the bamboo image is a very strong image. It's a rhizome image. Things can happen unexpectedly, so you never know what's happened. So, and that's for me also bamboo. So, the unexpected, the fantastic things that happen in your life, the way a small encounter or a small thing that you notice can evolve in completely different ways. So yeah, bamboo has been very, very important in my life, not only because I could do some nice technical things for plant production, but also because it really is ingrained in my life as a model of life.
Yes. So thank you for your time.
You're
And
welcome. You're welcome.
I appreciate
My pleasure. And if there are any questions from the audience, I'll
Yes.
be available online. That's some
I
fun.
would love to do that. Let's do a follow-up.